management and also worked in residential. So that's a little bit about my background. If there's any of you that I haven't met, feel free to reach out via email. I would love to meet as many of you as possible. Also, a little bit of an impromptu introduction that I forgot to mention to Sherry earlier, but and I am apologizing in advance to Keith for putting him on the spot, but Keith Williams is our new Children's Integrated Services Director in the CDD. So I'm wondering if you could turn your camera on, Keith, and introduce yourself as well as a new face.
Thanks, Nicole. Keith Williams, he, him, his, director in CIS, just celebrated 3 months in the job this week. So thank you very much. Excited to be here.
Thank you, Keith.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Nicole. The other thing I did want to apologize. We have such a big group. We were not going to do introductions for everyone at this meeting, and we have a combined group of folks. But at the next ELD meeting, we will take more time to introduce some members of the committee and the roles they play. But I thought in the meantime, it might be helpful either on your Zoom screen, or if you're not sure how to do that, in the chat, just to put in who you are and what role you play. And as we go through the presentation and the meeting, if you have questions, it would be helpful to just at least the first time state your where you come from or what your role is, just to help us as we're going through this meeting, because we don't have the time for introductions, that we have that opportunity to know sort of a little bit about you throughout the meeting. So that would be great. So thank you, everyone. Are there any other questions before we jump into it? I see that Katie Northey is here. Is the rest of the team here? Not.
We are.
You are. So you could. And you can share your screen. Oh, there's Lori, like looking all over the screen. If you folks are ready, we're ready to get started. I know it's a really tight time frame for all the incredible information you have to share. So any extra minutes we have are so valuable. So we'll turn it over we have Dr. Lori Meyer and Dr. Caitlin Northey, and we have Dr. Valerie Woods somewhere that I'm not seeing, but I think there she is, right? So thank you for joining us, and I just want to turn it over to you to get started. I had one question. While you're going through the presentation, do you prefer people like sort of hold questions or pop them? What would be, you can let us know what your preference is.
Thanks, Sherry. So we do have a chat monitor. So if you want to put your question into the chat, we will monitor there for it. We also have 2 times within our presentation where we're going to take a pause and we'll gather questions. As long as Valerie is the host, she's going to share her screen.
I'm going to try now to share my screen. Oh, you know what? I do not see the option. I think I might need to be made co-host. There it is. Thank you. Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Looking good.
Okay, great. And so Laurie, as you go, and Katie, just let me know when you would like me to advance the slide.
Okay, I think we're ready. Thanks, Valerie. Good morning, everyone. We are so happy to be able to talk with you about 2 projects that we conducted last year. So the first was the PI study, and the other one is the early MTSS 1-2-3 pilot project. So we're going to begin with an overview of those projects, and we're going to walk through first the PI study. So, and then we're going to take questions first about the PI study. Then we're going to give an overview, and we're going to walk through the early MTSS report. And we'll take questions about either the early MTSS and or the PI study. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end to have larger conversation around what are the future directions and implications of these 2 studies and projects. All right, next slide. So on behalf of Valerie and Katie, it was an extreme pleasure to work on both of these projects. To begin with the PIE study and to give you a sense of this work that took place in really the spring of last year. Katie and I interviewed Vermont state leaders to better understand the specialized needs for children with specialized needs in our early care and learning system in Vermont, with a goal of how to prevent their suspension and expulsion from those environments. I also was able to lead focus groups with Vermont early childhood professionals. So this consisted of individuals who were early care and learning providers. We also did focused groups with professionals from the Family Services Division and also from Children's Integrated Services. And those individuals who were not able to participate in a focus group, however, who wanted to still share their information and their ideas, they were able to fill out an electronic survey.
And then in addition to those groups, you can see there are 3 other groups of people that we interviewed or asked them to create a complete electronic survey. So one additional group was Vermont parents and caregivers. And so similar to what Lori mentioned, a recruitment flyer was developed in conjunction with CDD personnel. And we recruited families, parents, and caregivers to share their experiences of trying to access early learning and childcare with a specialized need. And they had the option to participate in a focus group or complete an electronic survey. We had a total of 16 individuals complete the electronic survey, and there were 5 interviews that wound up being one-on-one interviews, primarily for the purpose of this presentation, focus on the information that was shared via the electronic survey. And we're still in the process of unpacking some of our interview data. And I'm going to pass it to Katie to share experience with Arkansas and Colorado.
Yeah, so we selected Arkansas and Colorado in partnership with our Vermont colleagues at the state who are helping us. And we chose these 2 states because they were of interest and that they had been recognized nationally for doing good work in terms of preventing suspension and expulsion. And so I interviewed 10 leaders or personnel at the state level, in addition to program coordinators in both states. And those leaders represented multiple agencies at the state level. So there was Head Start representation, Department of Education representation, whomever was overseeing childcare, whomever was overseeing special education, and then any kind of partners they had in the state that really were at that upper top tier level of really coordinating services. Can you go to the next slide, Valerie? So we thought it would be helpful to share the recommendations that we came to at the for the PIES report based on the data that we had collected. And so we actually have 8 recommendations. Can you switch? Whoops, one more back, please. The first of which is collaboration. And so collaborations within and across state agencies strengthen the EC system. And as Valerie does our tech support here, sorry, Valerie. And they lead to new projects and improvements at the state. Oops. Yes, mental health providers. I'm gonna hold that question. Actually, can we respond to that question before we go on? Were mental health providers part of the EC folks who were interviewed or surveyed? In Arkansas and Colorado, they were included. Valerie or Lori, would you like to speak to Vermont?
Yes, so everyone was invited. I'll have to go back to look to see if anyone identified as a mental health provider, but I believe we did have representation from that subset of individuals.
Okay, thanks. So thinking about our recommendations. So the first one is collaboration. And so really one of our findings pointed to the fact that when there was collaboration at the state level, that it really improved the lived experiences of children, families, and the EC workforce. And so it created a shared knowledge and understanding of roles, responsibilities, and concerns. And this was done in different ways in both states, whether it was through a regular meeting in Arkansas or Colorado had done some learning lunches where people came and presented about the work they were doing and shared the experiences they were having. And having this time to come together really increased not only coordination across programs, which improved the efficiency when implementing services, but it also allowed state agencies to be responsive to what was happening in the field. It connected them directly to that implementation part of their work, and it allowed for strategic action. And I think because it was the leaders that were coming together, it meant that when they decided they wanted to tackle something, they had the authority to make change. And in isolation, they weren't as successful. So really thinking about how coming together as a team across agencies can support ongoing innovation and really what's happening as programs are being implemented. Can you go to the next slide, Valerie? So the other recommendation that came out of this data was the importance of a unified and leveled professional development system, and expectations that encourage early childhood professionals to engage in certain types of professional development. So the lit review that we had conducted, and really Valerie was the lead on that. She did a fantastic job, but it really showed that suspension and expulsion in early childhood settings could be reduced through training and PD focused on supporting children with specialized needs and children's social and emotional development. And so currently in Vermont, teachers' professional development opportunities are shaped by the settings in which they work often. And Colorado had one cohesive PD system that helped unify the field at the systems level and increase collaboration among state partners. And we were thinking that, Vermont can really incentivize teachers to get training in PD in those topics that the literature review suggests are helpful in preventing suspension and expulsion. Next slide. As many of you know, I'm passionate about helping the ECU workforce. It's one of my calls in this work. And so I don't think it surprised any of us that the literature review suggested that teachers' well-being really influenced whether or not they suggested a child for suspension and expulsion. So we know that teachers in early childhood settings are more likely to experience financial hardships, a lack of access to health benefits or other benefits compared to their, K through 12 or public school counterparts. In Head Start settings nationally, the early childhood mental health consultants provide support for teachers and children. And both Arkansas and Colorado shared a philosophy that adjusting adults' behavior was the best way to influence children's behavior. So their early childhood mental health consultants work closely with teachers and staff. So they're focused on educating the adults in children's lives. They also offered support to ensure that teachers are ready and able to meet children's needs. And often they describe that while the early childhood mental health consultants couldn't make some of the structural issues in teachers' lives go away that caused them stress, having the opportunity to talk about that and to process that meant that they were able to then focus just on children and really reduce suspension and expulsion. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Katie, for that wonderful overview. So I'm going to be walking us through the next few set of recommendations that came out of our work together to really look at this from a multifaceted perspective, state leader perspective, the EC professionals and workforce perspective, and the family perspective. One of the things that emerged was the recommendation to create a unified data system. So I'm going to read what's on the slide, just because that's kind of what I was taught as best practice, and then I will elaborate. So children with specialized health needs often receive care across multi-early childhood education settings and providers. One example is that they may access publicly funded pre-K and attend private childcare. We know that these systems are governed by agencies in Vermont. Therefore, it makes sense that Vermont should invest in a data system that can function across those agencies. So I took the lead on interviewing the parents and caregivers. And so one of the things that emerged, both from their interviews and in the literature review that was conducted, was this idea that families with, especially if they have a child with a disability or a special health need, they are often piecemealing their child. And we know in Vermont that publicly funded pre-K is very limited and does not meet the needs of parents and caregivers that want to work full time. So they are often juggling these multiple settings. And then from the child's perspective, they're juggling a need to learn different roles and expectations of both the settings and the individual teachers they're working with. So as a start, if a holistic unified data system was created, that's going to start to streamline those processes. One of the obstacles we ran into when we were carrying out this research study was just trying to understand what is the extent to which children, whether or not they have a specialized health need, are being suspended or expelled from childcare, right? We have some limited data that we could request from the Agency of Education, but there were challenges in accessing that data, in understanding the context for it, and then all the settings that are operating outside of the purview of the Agency of Education aren't required to report that data. So we, as a start, we need to understand what is the scope of the issue here in Vermont. And then when we were investigating this issue of suspension and expulsion, we thought about the creation of inclusion-centered policies. So inclusion of children with specialized health needs in early childhood education settings should be the norm, not the exception. And this should be supported in state level policy. We know that the ADA and IDEA both provide legal protections for individuals with disabilities. Therefore, Vermont early childhood education providers should be resourced to support all children and families seeking care, including those with specialized health needs. So again, families reported running into this issue where when they were accessing early learning settings through publicly funded pre-K, they did have access to supports through things like an individualized education plan, IEP, and all the supports that come along with the special education system. But then when their child would move to a privately funded daycare or a home provider, those same protections weren't necessarily in play. So that is one issue that as a state we need to be thinking about. And from the provider perspective, some of the barriers that they identified was the lack of knowledge. So that's where that PD system could come into play to support them in learning how to support children with various needs. Sometimes there's fear of a financial cost, right? So how can they, again, be resourced to make the appropriate accommodations within their setting when they're operating on razor thin profit margins? So see, we know these are some of the systemic issues that are at play. And then lastly, there's this idea of creating a process for a warm handoff. So many families are left out in the cold when their child is expelled from their early childhood education placement. Vermont should create a process for a warm handoff when it is known that a child will be expelled. When a provider is making this decision, which I want to say is never easy for them either, there should be a process in place for contacting child care resource experts that can connect with the families and help guide them to an alternative care arrangement. And so for this particular recommendation, there are many things at play. One is we know in Vermont generally, there's a child care crisis. There's not enough child care to meet the need, regardless of whether or not you have a child with a specialized health need. When you layer that issue on top of it, and you're looking for a child care provider that has that level of expertise where you can feel really confident that your child is going to have all their needs met, there's additional lack of capacity. So this is really a capacity piece. How do we increase the number of child care providers generally, and then specifically that have that targeted knowledge? And so the process for a warm handoff really should be when a provider feels for whatever reason that they cannot meet the needs of the child, we know that's going to happen sometimes. How can both the provider and the family, receive a consultation to say, there's another provider that we would like you to meet and kind of put you in contact with. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lori, who's going to walk us through the last couple of recommendations.
Thanks, Valerie. And Cheryl, thank you so much for your very thoughtful question. I will also expand on that to say that, as you might be able to tell right now, these recommendations come from all the data that we collected on this study, from the literature review to our interviews with state leaders, families, professionals. And when we spoke with state leaders, we spoke with leaders from across many of the agencies within our state government. So just to highlight, it was not just the Agency of Education and the Child Development Division. We spoke with representation from Head Start Collaboration Office, the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Health, Help Me Grow, Early Childhood Family Mental Health Leadership Team from a regional designated agency. And so we're really thankful to Jill Pearl, who was our project coordinator from CIS on this project, to guide us in who they felt were the stakeholders that really needed to contribute conversation and ideas to this study. And thank you for many of you, I see you in this meeting, who participated in a facet of this study. This next slide that you see in our next recommendation is taking a closer look and evaluating the use of one-on-ones in early care and learning settings. We know that not every child with a specialized need will require a one-on-one adult support to be successful in an early childhood education setting. However, some do. So Vermont should explore cases in which one-on-one adult support is being used, and to better understand the key issues and needs underlying the use of one-on-ones. It's possible that some of these students who are receiving one-on-one supports, their needs could be met with less intensive support. However, these less intensive supports are lacking in the current early childhood and education system, leaving one-on-ones as a catch-all resource to support children. So what does this mean? Even though our study's purpose and the guidance that we received from the state had nothing to do with specialized accommodation grants. The special accommodation grants was something that came up in many of our conversations with stakeholders. And when we explored that question further, it was because that is one of the few state resources available to programs to support children who need more intensive support. And so the one-on-one, in a way, when a child has challenging behavior, is having strong social emotional needs, the one-on-one is the solution, because it is perhaps maybe the only solution that some programs have available to them. And then as we explored that further, programs have struggled finding qualified one-on-one paraprofessionals. They struggle with keeping those professionals in their classroom settings. Their teachers struggle with being able to coach and give that one-on-one the support they need. And in some cases, depending on what entity hires and really is the manager for that one-on-one, whether it's the child care center or if it's the local education agency, whom that person works for and takes direction from can be in conflict with actually meeting the needs of the child. So taking a closer look at how one-on-ones is currently being used in Vermont, especially in our early care and learning settings, is in need of more in-depth study. Okay, next slide, please, Valerie. And that leads us to our final recommendation. It's intentional that we put it here, as the next project that we'll be talking about is the Vermont Early MTSS pilot project. But many people talked about implementing a more structured supportive system within Vermont to support children's social and emotional development. And all signs point to continuing to build upon the work of developing and scaling early MTSS in Vermont. So the implementation of early MTSS is a best practice for supporting children with challenging behaviors. Currently, Vermont supports the implementation of PBIS in K through 12 schools. Vermont should invest in a statewide effort to expand early MTSS practices in early care and education settings for young children to help prevent suspension and expulsion of at-risk children, including those with specialized needs. All right, Next slide, please, Valerie. So we're going to pause here and take your questions and comments about the PIES study. And Valerie, could we stop the screen share so we could see more faces at one time?
Perfect.
Yeah.
And we do have one question from Robin, and I think Valerie, I'm going to let you speak to it. She asked if we can elaborate on the role of families in the research project.
Great, thank you for that question. So yes, we knew that we really needed to understand the experience of parents and caregivers in trying to even access childcare and early learning for their child with a specialized health need. So as Lori and Katie mentioned, we work closely with Jill Pearl and Elizabeth Hallgood to help guide the way in which we contacted the different stakeholder groups, and that included parents and caregivers. So I worked with them to create a flyer that was distributed in a number of ways. One way was electronically through a Facebook group that I'm connected to. So I saw folks from Vermont Family Network. They were kind enough to let me post, hi Pam, to post the flyer on their closed Facebook page, but it's really a great way to reach out to other parents that have a child with a special health need or disability. And then we also circulated it to the CIS regional coordinators. They contacted various childcare and early learning professionals who may or may not have families in mind that were in the process of experiencing suspension and expulsion, or already had experienced suspension and expulsion. So that was a bit on our recruitment methodology. We had a lot more response to electronic survey. Again, this was conducted during the pandemic. So not surprisingly, trying to convince folks to set aside an hour, I tried to do early evening right after or before dinner as a way to kind of make it easy access, but really the ability to answer the questions in an electronic survey format at their preferred time was much more convenient for parents. Thank you.
So Pam asked, what did folks say about the role of CIS beyond ECFMH in supporting children and providers to avoid expulsion, especially EI and service coordination?
So from our conversations with providers, we got the sense that the water was murky, in the sense of there not being enough supports for the children, not enough capacity, and simultaneously not enough a coordinated effort across the different entities who have a commitment to doing this work. And so in many ways, everyone is kind of strapped to their limits, but everyone wants to see more and to see how we could achieve that in a collaborative fashion.
And I'd like to just add from the parent perspective, what really emerged from the narratives that they shared in the survey and also in the interviews I conducted was that these processes that we call suspension and expulsion, in the survey and in the one-on-one interviews, I provided them with a definition of what that actually looks like, because those aren't terms that are really in their day-to-day vocabulary. So it was like, is your child being asked to sit in the director's office frequently? And I'm also a parent, so you know this, I'm a parent of a child with a special health need, and reflecting back, like that happened to my son and he loved it. That's the thing, like he felt special and he was helping out, but he was also missing out on learning, right? So there's a certain disconnection there between the way we think about these words, the way it plays out in the early learning centers, and even the way our children view it, right? So there's a little bit of disconnect there that I want to acknowledge. But when I kind of provided these definitions of what it could look like, parents reported these are really they feel like informal conversations, right? I'm being pulled aside by the director and being said, well, your child is, having some difficulty. We're not sure that this is the right fit, right? Without being prompted to identify that as a conversation about a suspension or expulsion, they're not identifying it that way in their own minds.
Yeah, and let me build on that too. I was actually just going back into our data to think about the CIS teams that we spoke with. So from a CIS team's perspective, they shared that there are certain centers and programs within their region where they're constantly getting referrals for child behavior and recommendations to have a behavioral specialist work with a child. And so from their perspective, and this was a perspective held across several groups, was that it was the teacher who needed the coaching and the support to change the routines of the day, to change the way activities were done in the classroom, and that those changes in affecting the teacher and in the environment could be more powerful than providing direct service to a child. So even though they're receiving a referral for a behavioral support specialist or a mental health provider, what really might be needed is more at the classroom and teacher level. And in one CIS team in particular, they had the supports to actually place one of their CIS professionals into the classroom to help a child who had a specialized need along with the teachers in that classroom. And what they found is that, so when they had that professional embedded, they said the teacher, that way they're learning and not constantly referring the children back to us. So they were actually increasing the capacity and the skills within that center for that teacher to be able to meet the needs of the one child with specialized needs, but all of the children really in general.
We have another question about from James. How do we see these findings influencing implementation, specifically thinking about any examples of policy or regulation that might advance the research findings into reality? I think for me, because I'm so focused on the workforce, I think about a factor that we really need to unify policy and align policy so that it works across settings, right? We have different regulations in different types associated with different types of funding streams. So making sure that all of our teachers are required to have specific
it's a little echoey.
topics for ongoing learning, right? To help that we know can reduce suspension and expulsion, and also thinking about what those suspension and expulsion policies are across those settings. Head Start is very short, right? What is happening in the other settings? So aligning policy language and regulations would be a starting place for me.
Oh, what does that mean? Oh, you got them coming to your place. Yeah. Okay.
Wonder if we can mute, just because we don't need to hear everyone's conversations. They're probably private. Other questions?
I have a question, but I wanted a couple things I wanted to say that I appreciated in the beginning, and I'm not sure I could have interpreted this the way I wanted to hear it, but the acknowledgement of the role of the stress of the early childhood educator plays in the frequency of expulsion and suspension, or the potential role that stress plays in that. And I think we all would agree that when you're working in an occupation which makes it difficult to meet your own financial obligations, that would provide you significant stress in your life. And so I do think that the role of compensation, along with what we talk about in terms of preparation and ongoing in-service training to meet children's needs, are all a piece of that. So I wanted to comment on that. I also wondered if, when you talk about, the role of, and maybe this isn't something that but when we talk, you talk a lot about the role of early MTSS and the benefits for early childhood educators who have access to, be trained, well-trained and coached in that. Is that, what do you know about in terms of preparation programs in Vermont? And is that a piece of, preparation programs? I feel like we're talking about it a lot in terms of sort of, it's something that you build on the foundation of preparation that's already happened. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Katie, I wonder if you want to talk to the point around stress in the workforce. I know that came up when you were talking to state leaders, and then I can do the preparation piece.
Sure, that sounds great. Stress definitely came up when I was in conversations with state leaders in Arkansas and Colorado, and also when talking to leaders in Vermont and thinking about the realities of the workforce that cause great amounts of turnover and suspension and expulsion, right? And so we want to support a workforce. We want to set them up for success, which is why I think the preparation question is such a good one. And there's a quote in the report that I felt I had to include. One of the leaders said she was doing a technical assistance visit, and she was in an administrator's office, a childcare center administrator's office, and she saw tents. And she said, like, oh, are you doing camping? Like, what's happening? And she said, oh no, some of the teachers are homeless and we don't want them to sleep in their car. And the person said, here I was at that point trying to get these teachers to implement a child-centered curriculum and to think about, how they were approaching children and being less reactive. And she said, it's just a constant in our work that teachers are struggling. And I think it's something that we need to all consider.
And in terms of preparation, and Katie, I wonder if you have anything you could share from your representation on the Higher Ed Collaborative. But I could just speak for here at UVM. We do prepare our early childhood and early childhood special education students in early MTSS. And so that's the pyramid model approach and strengthening families. It's a core of their foundational knowledge. And Valerie, I'm not sure if you saw in the chat, there was a question from Charlotte. And Charlotte, I don't know if you are in a place where you could talk, but it says, I may have missed this. Okay, do you want to say your question?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
No, thank you. Thank you all for this this important discussion. I had wondered, and I so apologize if I missed this, but were any of the conversations, especially as we're thinking about like implementation, did they include providers and families, like guided conversations with both present, so we could talk about, mutually beneficial practices? I think there's often like focus group with families and focus group with providers, and then there's like this middle person having to communicate about those discussions. I was just curious if there were conversations with both present, and if not, if you plan to do so, and if you need support in doing so, because that feels like an important piece, especially as we talk about how to implement changes and or make policy sort of more standardized.
Thank you for that question. That's a great point. So we were thinking about the best way to structure the focus groups initially, and we did decide to deliberately hold those conversations between the families and the providers separately. And the reason for that is we were concerned that because Vermont is such a small state, and then you layer on, this issue of young children, right? We really wanted parents of young children 0 to 6, and then with a special health need that had or were at risk of experiencing suspension expulsions. We're talking about a really small slice of our Vermont, citizenry. And so we were concerned that we could get in a situation where in the same focus group, we had a family and then their actual provider, right? So that could have created some discomfort around the parent not necessarily feeling they could speak freely to some of the challenges that they might be experiencing at their early learning center, or vice versa. Providers maybe feeling like they have to hold back a little bit in terms of what are the challenges in terms of meeting the needs of some of the children at their center. So that was in fact a deliberate decision, but you make a good point about what could it look like if we brought those two groups together in a kind of facilitated dialogue. So thank you for the question. And Lori, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
No, I think you did a great job expressing that, Valerie, because we wanted that lived experience of families who had experienced suspension and expulsion or were going through it. That was one of the primary reasons, along with such a small subset of the families and children in Vermont meeting those criteria.
We have another question. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I see Robin and James, I see your question, and I have a feeling it might be touched on when I do the next slide deck. And if not, we'll have time to come back to those two questions at the end. I haven't read Cynthia's message yet, Kate. So if you've read Cynthia's, you'll be ahead of me.
I'm reading it now. Sorry, I'm just staying on top of this. Apologies. Curious how this report and findings will be used to impact investment along with policy. Vermont has a history of reimagining early childhood systems, but not investing to bring them to fruition. These themes are so familiar and relevant, yet I can't help but wonder about added pressures on the EC workforce, which may add to stress. Absolutely. And I think we have as a field, a history of ad hoc intervention and funding as well, which is really frustrating. I mean, even doing these reports, it was like, you know, they had a cutoff because the grant was over and, you know, Eli's job was shifting. Like it just, the fact that we even organize our state around government funding cycles, like it's very tricky.
And I also received a question around state system and state structure. And did we investigate any and have any implications for that piece of it? And I would say that we do not, and you won't see that in our report either. So our charge was really to understand the problem, understand the gaps, and understand the best practices that we are seeing in other states and in the literature, what's recommended. How that's actually implemented is different from state to state. And that is, I mean, at the time, there was even, you know, the wondering of would CDD and AOE, would they merge somehow? So it was underneath that atmosphere that we were doing the study. However, we were not charged with doing anything related to how CIS is governed, how any of the state agencies that touch the lives of these children, anything related to governance. And Katie or Valerie, please, you know, add to that.
The only thing I would say is that in one of the states, there was a recent reorganization where oversight of certain early childhood educational opportunities had shifted to be under the AOE, but because they had previously been housed, it just meant that they continued to work closely together and actually resulted in them having a bit more authority. The only other thing I would say, there was a question about data systems, and Arkansas had a unified data system that all stakeholders involved in working with a child could access. And they might not be able to pull or view all the data, but they could always contribute to it. And so that was an important aspect in that. Matt.
Yes, thank you. Sherry, and I think this is in spirit, and Nicole, I think this is in the spirit of how I usually participate in these meetings. So good morning, everyone. So I'm Matt Levin with the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance. As is noted in the name of my organization, we focus on advocacy to try to move things forward, right? So pertinent to the last question about making things actually be in policy and funding and so on and so forth, I would just note that if individuals or organizations are interested in having that conversation, then I'd be more than happy to talk with you. Usually we don't have the conversations in this meeting. That's sort of a bridge to a different place, but we at least point out that the bridge exists. So I'm the bridge. So if folks want to talk about advocacy and trying to move these things into reality in ways that, you know, go beyond the very appropriate role of the academics and the folks who are doing the studies, please feel free to be in touch. I think folks know how to get in touch with me. And again, we usually have those conversations in a different meeting. So just want to recognize that they do occur, and if people want to talk, to be in touch. So thanks.
I think time-wise, we might want to shift to the MTSS report.
Sounds good. Valerie, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen again. And we did save more time at the end because this is what we are hoping for: momentum building and conversation, you know, slow to start, more towards the end. So we'll have increased time at the end to talk again. Okay, so I had the pleasure of being the project director for the early MTSS 123 project. And so as we alluded to in the other study, this did happen during the pandemic. And I like to say that I proposed this project in February, before this was even really, at least on my mind, that this was a possibility of what could happen. And by the time we knew that we had received the project, it was a full-fledged pandemic. And if you could just remember back to last year, everything was so uncertain for our early learning programs and what things would look like. And everyone was really focused on keeping their staff and their children and their families safe. And so, you know, I just want to thank every single person, but I'll get to that. The meaning of 123, what is that? So it was to guide the work of the project. So one being one unified early childhood system. So coming together to implement early MTSS, because that's truly what is required. 2 stood for the 2 social emotional frameworks that were at the focus of this project, which were the pyramid model framework and the strengthening families framework. And then 3 represented the 3 foci groups that were really the heart of the project, which were children, families, and their providers. So we are grateful to have 3 pilot regions working with this pilot that included regional coordinators and a regional leadership team. And so you see here Franklin Glen Isle, Orleans North Essex, and Northern Windsor Orange were our 3 pilot regions. And we had 5 practice-based coaches who served on the project to help implement early MTSS. And we had a state advisory group. Okay, next slide, please. And again, an extreme huge thanks to everyone who participated in this project. And I apologize, I have the jets flying through, so you might hear that in the background. And thankfully, we were able to offer some of our trainings and some of the supports and resources provided through the project to other participants across the state. So everyone who took the energy and time to participate, I'm so grateful. So thank you. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the goal of the project was to implement support teams, to support the implementation of early MTSS and to pilot it. And in essence, the goal was to implement the first year of a scale up and sustainability plan. And then from that learning, develop a longer term plan for the state. So a lot of this project was doing. So we had to get in there and do what we said we were going to do, which was support the implementation of early MTSS. So we had 2 implementation sites from each pilot region. And our regional leadership team members were instrumental in identifying who those pilot sites would be. When I first proposed the project of how we would identify those implementation sites, because the state really wanted to have 1 year's worth of work happen in like a 6-month time period, I figured what we would have to do is have programs that were really close to already being demonstration sites, meaning that they were already implementing the pyramid model and strengthening families to fidelity or close to fidelity, and that we would learn what those programs needed to get there and to keep them there. But with just the wisdom of our state advisory group and our regional leadership teams, what they felt in that period of time, what we really needed was to focus on the programs with the most need. And that made sense because from their perspective, the programs that were already close to being a demonstration site or were a demonstration site implementing these frameworks in their programs and they tended to be well resourced. So instead we focused on implementation sites who were in the most need, and discussions on who those implementation sites would be within a region that began in September. And our initial project deadline was December. So we all anticipated that this work would start quickly, we would learn as fast as possible, and that the funding would end in December. We were grateful that the funding actually was able to be extended into March, but we were working with that initial December deadline from the beginning. So as a result of improvement that we saw within the programs that participated, every program, so this would be one classroom in their program increased their fidelity to the pyramid model. One site reached demonstration status, just demonstration site status. So that means they were doing 80% or more of the practices related to the pyramid model in their site. And 2 sites were very close to this benchmark. Okay, next slide, please. Another piece of this project was integrating strengthening families and the pyramid model. I think this is actually very forward thinking of Vermont and very cool. And as I had a couple opportunities to present on this project work as we were doing this project work. And it was something that people were routinely throughout those conversations interested in. Like, oh, you're doing this? That makes a lot of sense, because strengthening families in the pyramid model, especially the base of the pyramid, it's all about supporting families, supporting children's relationships with their caregivers. So what a natural fit, but this hadn't been done before. So there are no materials related to the actual formal integration of these 2 frameworks. And so we truly just put a toe in the water for how to do this work. And we were grateful to do it in collaboration with Maureen Durning and Jane Zink, who created the STRONG curriculum, which is widely used in Vermont, that is essentially focused on how to implement strengthening families, the 5 protective factors in early learning settings. And so our wonderful practice-based coaches, they took what they've learned about the STRONG curriculum and they formally integrated it into the pyramid model trainings that are often given as part of the foundational early MTSS trainings. And so we have now 19 professionals in the state who receive that integrated blended training. And if you download the official report, you'll see in the appendices, we have slides of the examples of how those 2 were integrated in the training. Now, strengthening families is not a curriculum. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do. The STRONG training is really a training for professionals to think about the protective factors in their everyday life, how to see them, how to support them, how to nourish them and others. But unlike the pyramid model, which has a fidelity of implementation tool, so we could actually make observations of teachers. We could say, okay, you're doing this practice, you're not doing this practice, I could coach you to do this practice. That isn't currently available for the strengthening families. So Brenda Schramm, myself, Maureen, and Jane, we've been working on a profile of practice for the strengthening families. And this is work that is continuing post-grant, unfunded, but just something that we believe strongly in to really realize the vision of supporting the coaching of strengthening families and the integration of it with the pyramid model. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in order to build capacity, and I should say early MTSS and implementation of the pyramid model is nothing new, and even implementation of strengthening families, it's nothing new to Vermont. We have such a rich community of assets around these 2 frameworks. And so really what we were doing is simply increasing capacity and trying to understand what would be needed in order to continue to increase the capacity for professionals to implement these 2 frameworks. So we partnered with the Pyramid Model Consortium. They are national experts who are really the only ones who do national level and provide at that level of training related to tools for the pyramid model approach. And so we were able to host 2 trainings on the fidelity tools linked to the pyramid model, which is the TPOT, so the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool. That's what's used in preschool settings, and then the Tippy Toes, which is for infant and toddler settings. And so you'll see the number of individuals from our state who were trained in reach reliability, which means now they could be trained assessors going into programs and observing and helping other providers in their regions. We also did e-pyramid model facilitation training, and Robin and James, your conversation about leveraging technology to support professional development. I will get to that in just a moment, but the e-pyramid module facilitation training was a big piece of what we learned. So the e-pyramid modules are online learning modules that are provided through the PMC that providers can access at any time at their own convenience. And what 19 individuals in Vermont were trained on was how to facilitate that online experience. So how do you facilitate a group of teachers who are learning these modules, perhaps on their own time? And then how do you guide them through that learning on their own time? How do you facilitate in like a community of practice like group setting to further the conversation and move that learning from one-on-one by yourself online learning to then in your group making sense of that learning? So we were so excited to be able to provide that training in Vermont for the first time. And then we provided practice-based coaching. So this is really the next tier. So when you have a mentor teacher who's really well-versed in the pyramid model and to take them to the next level of helping coach and train others, practice-based coaching is that kind of foundational skill that they would need to learn to move people forward. So we had 5 people participate in that training. 2 were part of our pilot project coaches who were wanting to be refreshed on coaching strategies. And we'll say that this was an intensive training. It was 2 days, full day in February. So one, teachers who may be in that position to move into a coaching role, they may not have had the time to participate. It was over winter break time, but I think at that point in our life, we all needed a break. I think at that time too, everyone was probably suffering from Zoom fatigue. So that had a lower turnout than we anticipated because the regional leadership teams all really emphasized the need, and having practice-based coaching was at the very top of their wish list. And then thankfully, because the project was extended into March, we were able to hold 2 sessions of the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce training. This training is what we consider kind of like the top of the pyramid training for children with the most intensive behavioral needs. The PTRYC framework is designed to be implemented by early childhood professionals. So it's geared towards the people who are working in your programs right now, not necessarily the behavioral support specialists. Certainly though the strategies that were part of that training, specialists could use those skills to teach early childhood professionals how to create the environment to support that child well. That was an extremely popular training. We had 60 individuals participate. As I wrote up the final report, people were still emailing me to ask if we were going to have another one. And I've gotten emails all summer about people interested in this training. And so I've been sharing, there's a subset of people who attended that training who feel like they could pay it forward and train others on this in Vermont. So I am sending those names of potential trainers to anyone who's interested. Okay, next slide, please. All right, another big piece again of the project was trying to actually identify and visualize who were people in our state who had assets related to the early MTSS. Essentially because, again, this wasn't a new thing that was being piloted necessarily for the first time. So I'm going to read a quote by John Kretzman, who's one of the founders of the idea and concept behind asset mapping. And so he said, asset mapping is a process for engaging the community to discover and connect with its own assets. So what we created with 88 participants, mostly in our pilot regions, but also people from across the state chose to participate. We were able to create Google Maps of the assets in our state. And so this was a project that I worked with the regional leadership teams on. Again, this was something that I'd like to see continued. I have work on this that I want to be able to pass off to the regional leadership teams, for example, how to keep this type of asset map going post-project. But again, that's all work that's happening now outside the life of the project since the project has ended. But we have the assets mapped on who are the centers that have reached demonstration status, who are the people who are trained as reliable TPOT assessors, where do they live within the region? And another piece that people were interested in, particularly in the regional leadership teams, was creating communities of practice within regions for people who are really passionate about early MTSS. So we have 20 people who are currently interested in participating in the COP around early MTSS who want to participate, and 24 more who are interested. And we are hoping that that is also something that may continue beyond the life of the project. But again, unfunded, this would be work that people would just be picking up. And many of our, well, I would say some of our pilot regions, this is work that they have continued to do in between funding from the state. So they've continued to do this work in between Race to the Top to the PDG funds. And now we'll see if that work can still continue without a formal state funding system. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to close before we talk about some of the major recommendations that came from this pilot project. So one is the idea of truly needing support teams. So the concept and a definition of a support team wasn't provided at the start of the project. So we had to really come to that understanding of what is a support team to support early MTSS in our state. And so the stakeholders who participated in the project, they said a support team isn't just one team. We need a team across levels. So we need a team dedicated, primarily focused on early MTSS at the state level. And we need that team to be down into the regions, and then we need to have it even at the local level. So multiple support teams and points for support across our system. There was a need for some sort of policy solution. Some stakeholders felt one that cut across agencies, because supporting children with challenging behaviors, similarly to supporting children with specialized needs, that cuts across the systems currently in our state and across agencies. So developing a policy solution to how we implement early MTSS in the state is necessary. There's also a conversation, and I should also say that it was noted that something new might have to be created. Okay. There was talk about how early MTSS really sits at the intersection of a couple key pieces of our early care and learning system, one being professional development and the other one being the quality rating system. So our STAR system in Vermont. And then the need for coaching, for actually having support for teachers to move them forward in their implementation and in their practice of these two frameworks. And the final recommendation that you'll find in the report was a 3-year sustainability and scale up plan for how Vermont can continue this work forward, starting with this academic year. Most scale up and sustainability plans are 4 to 5 years. So one of my recommendations is that this plan should be planned for even further out than just 3 years. And because we may not be actualizing this plan and using it at this moment, we have to think about that and take that into consideration as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is that sustaining and scaling plan? So recommendations are to have a dedicated team to guide the work, and guiding the work of all of those support teams and all of the pieces. There is a lot of facets to implementing early MTSS well, from training and technical assistance and guiding even the leadership team at the state level in their work and in their thinking. So having a dedicated team, a TA center, somehow support and guide the continuation of the early MTSS work, and actually establishing a formal state leadership team, as this is part of people's work and responsibilities. And so they have the agency and the authority to make the changes in policy and practices that we need to see done in order to make the implementation of early MTSS a reality. Along with continued, and actually not continued, but new funding and support for the establishment of regional leadership teams. So all of the people who are engaged in this work are doing it as service. They're doing it, maybe it's related to their work and their roles, but they don't have this formal participation and process to thoughtfully engage and really honestly engage with the work. Another key thing is that we have very, very good demonstration sites in our state around these two frameworks. We need to learn from one another. We need to see Vermont examples of how this is being implemented in our programs. And so we need to be able to both identify and raise up and promote those demonstration sites and continually add new ones to that list. And another piece would be to have a state-affiliated practice-based coaching team. So coaches who are known and who people can go to for reliable support around implementing either one of the two frameworks. So continuing to support that and increase that effort. Okay, and the next slide, please. All right. Promising practices is the use of technology. So because we were piloting this project in a pandemic, we had to use technology, as many programs didn't want to have external observers and coaches actually in their program. And so we used different types of technology. So we actually got permission from Head Start to using their coaching collaboration cloud. So our coaches were able to take videos and teachers were able to take videos. We use swivel technology, which allows teachers to record what's happening in their classroom environment, and then they could safely put it up into the Head Start's coaching cloud so that the videos were secure and safe. And so teachers and coaches could share videos and communicate through that platform. And so that was an amazing resource that we were able to use to support remote coaching. And also, I think a promising practice is there's a few studies right now around group coaching. So not necessarily coaching teachers one-on-one, but coaching groups of teachers within centers and across centers. And this is a very new area of research, but it's a very promising area of research. It's being shown to be just as successful as one-on-one coaching and less resource intensive. And what it's also, so one of the newer studies is showing is that, and you probably know this from your experience, not every teacher needs the same intensive amount of support when it comes to implementing these practices. So with group coaching, you can differentiate, just like we do with children, you can differentiate your teaching and your resources as a coach for giving more to people who need more support, and the people who don't need as much, but maybe they need an article here or there, or maybe they just need a check-in. Everyone gets what they need. So group coaching blended with using the ePyramid modules. The ePyramid modules would replace in-person training on the pyramid model, which is very resource intensive because you need one trainer's full day or 2 days to deliver that training to your entire staff. Whereas with the ePyramid modules, professionals can do that on their own time. And then I think a promising practice really is continuing to work on blending strengthening families with the pyramid model, especially because they are two key frameworks that are being used in our state. And I think more integration and having those together as the foundation of our early MTSS system is a very promising place to be. Okay. So as you could see, these two projects really worked together and have some shared implications. So we'll stop sharing the screen and we'll open it back up to questions either around the early MTSS project or a combination of both. We're all still here and happy to talk. Okay, so Katie, I saw a lot of questions come up when I was talking. Well, not a lot, 7, but I haven't followed them.
There were some comments about data and what's available regarding suspension and expulsion in Vermont. But if anybody has questions that they had previously put in the chat that they don't think were answered, please feel free to ask them.
Yes, Charlotte, I agree. Family partners being a part of that formal state leadership team, important, and representation around the regional leadership teams as well. Family voices is always an important piece to include. Yeah, how will the recommendations be moved forward? That's a great question. And actually, I want to thank Sherry and the leadership team of this committee. They posed 3 really powerful questions. So these questions don't come from us. I'm just going to repeat your questions, Sherry, because I think they're so fruitful to talk about. So these 3 questions are: 1, what strategies and investments are needed to meet each and every child's needs? 2, are there specific recommendations or solutions that would reduce or eliminate expulsion rates that should be elevated? And 3, what are the gaps and the opportunities? So how do we move these recommendations forward?
This is Valerie. I just want to add, as folks are contemplating that question, one of the things that emerged from the literature review that I think is a really powerful advocacy point is we know many of the supports that are recommended in an early MTSS model, especially if you're looking at that universal level, they help all students. And that's a way to really build a wide base of stakeholder support to say, this isn't just if you have a child or a student with a disability or special health need. It's not this kind of group of other people out there that we're trying to direct resources to. These are strategies and supports that universally help the world of young learners. And so I think when we can start to build that wider advocacy base, and then take that forward in the realm of politics, right? You can get more movement in that way.
Yeah. And to put the question in around recommendations for funding and sustainability, the thought was building that universal capacity would then alleviate some of the strain on our early childhood and mental health professionals and behavioral specialists, whom we have few of, where if the needs of a teacher or program are at that universal level, like those needs could be met. And then the children and families who truly need that one-on-one support and targeted support, there would be the capacity to meet those needs. And in terms of funding, one of the things I would like to see is something that mirrors what we have in our K through 12 world in PBIS. Early MTSS is essentially the same thing, but our programs don't receive the funding to implement it well. I think similar to what we see at the school age level, programs need to have access to funds so that they could decide how they want those to be used to implement early MTSS. What does their program need? Do they need coaching? Do they need support? And moving the work that, one of the things that we found was that individual programs, they don't have the capacity necessarily to create a leadership team within their own program to implement this work. It's a lot to do. So moving that up into the regional level where they could provide regional guidance, that could also lead to memorandums of understanding where people are sharing resources, sharing coaches across supervisory unions, across centers. It's really this holistic working together piece. Matt, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna sort of repeat what I said a few minutes ago, but your comment is a really good segue. So thank you. Just as you're commenting on how pushing these things up to a regional level allows for better implementation and coordination and collaboration and all the rest, it's similar in terms of advocacy. If folks are interested in pushing for these policies to move forward, I'd encourage you to think about what statewide organizations you may be a member of. Those organizations can take a position and can do action to promote a policy or support a policy or to push for funding. So again, not a subject for this meeting, but just to point out that if you are a member of a statewide organization, you can get in touch with them and ask them, what are we doing as an organization to advocate for whether it's funding or policies, or as Robin points out in the chat, a different point of view about implementation. That's where a lot of the advocacy happens at the statewide organization level. So if you're interested in that, reach up to those folks, use your membership as an avenue for participation and activity. And there are a lot of organizations that are working on this. Again, different conversation than today, but I really appreciate the depth of what you're presenting today. It's a very helpful background information. Thank you.
I also see some questions, if I can just jump in as a next step to Matt's comment, that around kind of what are some next steps for implementation, and also add that these strategies are also included in the policy recommendations that came from both of these committees, Child Outcomes and Early Learning and Development. So those are in draft form, unfortunately not ready to share today, but essentially had small group discussions at the VCAP Summit in July, and we'll have those to share shortly. So that is good news in terms of being able to continue to elevate the need for sustainable funding for these strategies.
Thanks, Beth. And Shelley, I see your comment around centralizing professional development around early MTSS. And I believe, so your suggestion, what about an early ed BEST Institute offered across the region? So I'm guessing like BEST, like what we see at the K through 12 level. Yeah, and I think that also having that kind of type of institute, that kind of focused intentional efforts around implementing early MTSS, I would agree is something that's needed within the BEST Institute and the Vermont PBIS and BEST team. I mean, they're the ones who support their projects in things like data systems, collecting fidelity of implementation data. And so that type of system and structure of something that's centralized and again, focus that this is the work that they do, similar to what we see for the school age children is needed. And I think very forward administrators in certain supervisory unions in our state are very passionate about trying to connect and link these two systems, because of what they realize is what we all realize, is that even though a child isn't school age yet, if they're in a child center in your community, they will be a part of, most likely, a part of your school system, and they will come to you. And we know about early prevention. And so, I mean, I think very forward-thinking leaders know that moving this down into the early childhood level and creating that linkage, really supporting social emotional development now in the face of all of the struggles we've seen Vermonters go through because of the pandemic and even before the pandemic, this is really important.
I just wanted to make a few comments and then I have just maybe a question. So first I was really, one of the barriers has been the inaccessibility, particularly to early childhood educators working in private programs. So I love the recommendations around the using technology, sort of like that's what you had to do. And that is certainly, a format that could make it more accessible. I also really appreciated the differentiated coaching model and thinking about, those that need more intensive support being available for that. And, just the light touch on those that are, implementing in a way that is, stronger than the others. And then I think, one of the things that came up earlier and then is around, back when I was, director of 8 sites, the first visit, and it wasn't called CIS then, it was, I don't know, it might've been CUPS, it might have been whatever was before CUPS, but the first, when we were, experiencing like, not as successful as we wanted to be with a child, our first visit from that support organization or agency or individual was about the learning environment. Like, and that was like, and maybe that isn't the case anymore, but that was just the way, when you were going to reach out, their first visit was really an assessment of the learning environment that was present for the child and the interactions. And that was the focus of, a few visits and the plans and, and then, it really sometimes it did lead into more specific direction, support, resources needed for a family or child. And I just don't know how that has changed because I don't provide direct service, but it was often, I will just say that was often extremely valuable. And because it was just part of the culture of how it happened, it was very accepted by the teaching staff and those, or the, family childcare home that was, that's what they were expecting, to get help with what they could do better. And I don't know if that's changed, but it is a really effective model to start there for sure. And then, and Pam had mentioned that earlier about the role of CIS. I wanted to comment on that. And then the last thing that I want to comment is I really feel that until we're better resourced, it's going to be so hard to really implement this in the way that is going to benefit all Vermont children, because when we talk about PBIS in the schools, or we talk about a new literacy curriculum in the schools, the training is available to all of the educators and they're paid to attend it. And, the system that we have right now for early educators is often they have to pay for the training to get it, and they're not paid to get the training. So, it really is part of the system when we think about the resources, that we have to think about the standards and competencies and skills we want all early educators to have, and to make that accessible to all of them.
Lori, there's a question in the chat. Are you seeing it? Do you have any ideas for how we can support the sustainability funding of early MTSS similar to PBS and school age? Great recommendation. How can we leverage EC state leaders, BBF, SAC, etc.?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I feel like one that I would be lying if I didn't say that throughout the entire implementation of last year's project, that was a question that kept me up at night, that I was thinking about a lot. And because I always come at it from like a researcher perspective, and I'm not necessarily a policy expert. Thank goodness we've got Katie Northey here in our UVM team. But how can we leverage early childhood state leaders? I mean, early MTSS is in our action plan for the state. It's something that so many leaders are committed to doing and have said so publicly. So it's almost to Matt's point. I don't know where the point of advocacy starts or ends, or maybe we're walking across that bridge now, but I would just say, like, I think it's time that we really take a stand. And and Valerie, I see your hand. You just take a stand. And when are we going to actually advocate for those funds that we see in other programs? And because I really care about supporting the social emotional development of young children and their families, and I think that is key. And I know many of you also believe this, that it's key to being and having a high quality of life, and to have a successful and healthy and safe Vermont. That, to me, I would say, put your money here, start here. If we're going to actually try to envision a system that looks different, let's try something new. Let's try it around early MTSS, because this is what's going to be most beneficial for our children and for our families and for our providers, keeping their environments healthy, keeping them happy. I mean, I think that if we took one thing to focus on to try something new, it should be this. Okay, Valerie.
Thank you. So I'm just going to put a plug in for the fact that we're in a very exciting time at a federal level to think about universal pre-K, because what the research found is this risk for being suspended and expelled if you're a child with a specialized health need. So the risk, we know that risk is elevated for that group of students, even at these young ages. It happens at that 3 and 4 year old mark, because you think about an infant, a toddler, they're smaller, they have limited mobility. A lot of times these behavioral issues aren't flagged in terms of needing a screening to determine if there is a disability present until around between ages 2, 3, 4. And then you see, without supports in place around that student, those behaviors do tend to escalate. And then, the teacher's stress level increases, and it creates, without the supports, it creates a cycle that the risk of suspension and expulsion then becomes higher. When we put the supports in place of a generalized education system that says all 3 and 4 year olds now have access to a full day of education, full IEP supports and rights, those disparities and inequities, they don't disappear, but they're greatly alleviated, right? Because we have all the laws and protections that say those children and families now have access to those resources. So I think, you know, as a parent that went through this myself and then talking to other parents, the current pre-K system does not work. If you want to work full time, it does not support you, right? And private childcare is so expensive that you have to be working at a high paying job to even make the cost benefit analysis worth it. So then those families that can't afford that, they're at home with their child who's not going to get the same level of kindergarten readiness, right? So they come in. So we're setting these children and these families up to kind of continue to financially struggle. And one of the things I put in the report is that this issue, it sits at the intersection of a child's right to an education and a parent's right to work. If a parent wants to work, they need these supports in place and they should have equal access. And so then it ties into what is the professional development available that gives our providers the self-efficacy and confidence to feel good that they can take care of these children. So I think, you know, to me, if as a state, you know, none of us know what's going to happen with this federal package, but it's being talked about. And I think as a state, we need to think about what does that look like in Vermont to move that forward. Thanks.
Thank you. There's just a few comments. So take a look at the chat there. I don't think they're questions. They're just ideas and things that we should capture to think about.
It would be great to have the people that worked, the teams that worked on PDG funded projects get together and talk about their findings and think about next steps and how to keep that work alive. Because I think, you know, like the PDG B5 TA conference is in October and I'm presenting there on another project, right? But like, what are we doing at the state level, right? We're doing things at a national level, but what are we doing at the state level? And I also think just in terms of policy, there's been a lot of comments about some of the systems and structures or things that we want to change, like funding at the top tier level. Remember, there's low hanging fruit as well. It would be great to have a common shared set of definitions about what is suspension and expulsion in an early learning setting that we could then apply across all settings, right? So there's low hanging fruit here too.
Yeah, and something that Linda brought up, she was wondering about the ARPA money and how that might be used to do some of these initiatives. And I wonder that too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to wrap up our presentation. Does anyone have any other last minute? I want to thank the three of you for coming. This was a great presentation and so much to think about. And Katie, you finished with a great question, and because I don't participate in that group, I don't know who that is, but that does seem like it would be a great action step, to follow up on for sure. See, so thank you, Valerie and Katie and Lori for coming, and we really appreciated it. And we had a great turnout for this presentation, and I know we have others looking forward to the recording. So we thank you, and there's a good chance we'll reach out again. We may have some additional questions, or might want to sort of a follow up on some specific things, and we'll definitely be back in touch. And thank you for all of that. This was really great. I really appreciate it. I know everyone did, as you can tell by the huge turnout of everyone showing up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a privilege for us to get to do this work for our state. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. The next part of our agenda, I believe, is Beth. There's so many of you on the screen, I can't ever find who I'm looking for.
I'm here.
Yes. So I think what we wanted to talk about next was really about our role in the ELD in terms of monitoring goal 3, and specifically over the next year, our role as an advisory committee for the early childhood system analysis. That's going to be happening. So I know they had an orientation for us, and some of you were able to attend, some of you have watched the recording, but I thought it might be helpful for Beth to give us a little snapshot of that again and be available if you had specific questions.
Thanks, Sherry. Yes, this is a really exciting project. So just a refresher or preview for those who might not have watched the video of our orientation, and we'll encourage you to check out those materials. But essentially, as part of H-171, the Child Care Bill, which is now Act 35, I think it's called, was a call for an early childhood systems analysis. And BVF was tasked with overseeing that, or identifying a consultant and pulling together an advisory committee to serve as an accountability and resource for that consultant. So just on that the very big picture, the systems analysis we identified a contractor through a competitive process, Foresight Law and Policy and Watershed Advisors. And the analysis is really intended to develop recommendations in what you see as the following areas, really around childcare and early childhood education and how to strengthen those systems. So around organization, capacity, functioning of the state government to meet the needs of families. So that's at the very high level. Next slide, please. So just for sake of time, I'm not going to repeat the orientation other than just to remind folks of kind of the scope of the systems analysis. And so there's a few slides just to review that very high level. And then I would encourage, and I can get folks the link to the recorded orientation. Next slide, please, Sherry. But just at the very high level, we identified a consultant group that is just coming on board. This project will run from essentially now, September, through the end of next June, which is when there will be a report presented to the legislature. And the process will include a document review and summary, information gathering through key informant interviews, focus groups, community conversations, surveys, et cetera, again, coming from the consultant. They will analyze the results and maintain connection with the advisory committee and come back with a draft report. So essentially, we have put together an advisory committee. You can advance to the next slide, which is composed of 3 existing groups. We were working hard to not call together a separate new group. But essentially, the Rfp Advisory Group, which has some legislators on it, the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Team, and the Early Learning and Development Committee. So I know that folks who are part of the ELD committee have heard a little bit more about this, and I'm thrilled to have some folks from the Child Outcomes Accountability Team here today who may still be on, which is great to get a sense of what is going on within our systems work. And then really trying to have broad stakeholder engagement in that advisory committee. The advisory committee, next slide, please. The advisory committee will meet roughly 5 times over the next couple months. We have yet to identify a September meeting, which will be the first meeting with the consultant group. So hopefully we'll get you a date next week. And then meeting November, February, and probably in April to get updates from the consultant. Those meetings will be recorded. We know that it's a large group, and we'll provide opportunities for you to provide input. So we're calling those works in progress meetings, and then a final report meeting, and we'll have a webinar next summer. So that's just a very high level role of the Early Learning and Development Committee as part of this advisory committee. There are some new folks that we are formalizing membership for Early Learning and Development. It maintains an open meeting, but for I think it will make this group much stronger if we know who to expect and can really formalize that membership. Next slide, please. So just the role of the advisory committee is to help the contractor stay focused on the goals and objectives, to provide feedback to the contractor in terms of collecting information from the field, making sure that the representative sample information gathering, providing input around the works in progress, and then engaging partners in the field. So again, this is a very high level systems analysis, and really appreciate lots of positive feedback and engagement so far. So thank you. So I will pause there. We can pull down the slides and see if there are any questions about the process as we are just getting oriented and started. Great. So, yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
No, I was just, and you said the first, we'll have probably the date for that first meeting come out next week.
I hope so. We are meeting with the consultants on Monday, and we'll set that first date. Everyone is really ready to get going.
And I hope when we had the slide up, some of you saw there were some dates already identified. So just to make note of those and put a hold on your schedule. And like Beth said, though, they will be recorded. So there's something that you could revisit as well.
Right. The idea was to use existing meetings. So there will be some of those meetings that fall on this Thursday when ELD normally meets, and some that fall on Wednesday afternoons when ECICT usually meets. So to the best of your ability to participate, we will be thrilled to have you.
Great. So Beth, there is a question about, is there any link to the healthcare partners participating on the advisory, in part of the advisory body?
We do have healthcare representation on that committee, which is great, as well as joining early learning and development. So I think one exciting piece that is in formalizing membership is also identifying what voices do we feel like we want to have represented. I would say at all the VCAP committees, but the focus, has been around early learning and development. So having after school representation, healthcare representation, business, et cetera, parent. So there, we still have some gaps, but working to fill those.
Any other questions?
So again, thank you all for your time and thoughtfulness and engagement. And if you are looking for the link, once I stop talking, I can go and find that link for you all to be able to watch that orientation and get moving.
Thanks, Beth. Let's see, I need to. The next piece we were going to talk about is I sent ahead last year, and the committee worked on coming up with a shared understanding of when they were talking about like high quality, what were the components of high quality? And I did share that out, and I don't have it ready to pull up, but I can, I had it ready to pull up, and then I had technical difficulty, and now I have to go back through to try to find it. But we did send that out in advance, and my understanding is that's something that the Early Learning and Development Committee worked on during the past year, revised it with a couple of goals that for this committee, when we use that language, this is what they came to in consensus of the components that are included when we throw that word out there, high quality. As someone who's been in the field since 1987, I know that we can debate quality since even before that. And there's, that there could be more, there could be less, but I want to really respect the work of the committee that was done over the past year. And one of the other goals was some accessibility to the statement. So keeping the language in a way that, if there's someone who's outside the field of working with children or less familiar, working with young children or with these committees, that it was something that was accessible and understanding for all. So that's the statement that was put forward. And so we're not at this point going to edit it. I think it would be a really great idea for a spring meeting for that to be on our agenda and just to check out, how we feel it fits. As we go through the year, we get new information like we learned today, as we're thinking about our system and all of those pieces. So, we'll use that as a shared understanding if everyone can agree to that and respect the work that was done, and also agree that it's something that we should, look at probably on an annual basis to see if it still fits and if there's new information or new thoughts we have in wanting to make edits. Is there any other feedback around that statement? I just applaud the committee the year before, because never before have we actually had, I have been on and off this committee for many years. It was different names also. And never before have we actually come to consensus in a way to get something that, I thought it struck a tone with me, and so I appreciate the work of the committee, and I do think it's important. As a committee, we're not saying this is Vermont's, necessarily definition, but as a committee that we have some components we all agree to, and I think that's important. So that's great. Yes, Matt. You're on mute.
Thank you. So I appreciate all the work that's gone into it. And Sherry, so I have a question that is not meant to contradict what you just said, but as the process person and not the technical person, I can't help but my reaction when looking at all this was, as determined by who? I don't mean to upset the apple cart, because I really appreciate the thought that went into this, and I mean, again, I'm not in any position to disagree with it because I don't do the service delivery. I'm not trained in all this stuff. But as someone who, again, is looking at it from the outside, it seems strange that the document doesn't at least have some, doesn't address that question. Although maybe the best thing to do is to stay silent on it, because the alternative is it's just too complicated. So again, don't mean to upset the work that's been done. Really appreciate it. If the decision is to be silent on that, then fine. But at least one reader, me, looks at it and goes, so who determines what that is?
Can I chime in, Sherry? Yes. Thank you. Matt, one of the things I think it's right that we look at this again in the spring and let it sit. I really agree with that. And one of the things I keep reminding myself about this is that I don't think it should be called a definition, because that is not what it is, right? So I think we should be really careful with our words there. As Sherry said, these are commonalities of high quality across systems. So what are some of the characteristics we can point to, so that when we say high quality in this meeting, it doesn't mean something different, whether I'm at CIS or Early Head Start or you in the state. But what we know is that EC services in Vermont that are of high quality meet some similar commonalities. And I think we have to remember to think about that broad, because every one of us, as Sherry pointed out, the way we've talked about this all these years, I hear definition of quality and I cringe, because I think we're talking about the definition of early childhood in my mind, which is like, you know, center-based family child care home, you know, like my definition of early childhood, right? From that perspective. So I want to throw that out there, but I think that that's also a great question, Matt. And, you know, any document that should at least reference the source of some sort, but I think that's a good question to start.
Tanya, I think that makes good sense. If you take the word definition out, then it becomes a guiding star, you know, a guiding point, set of points, as opposed to something that people are going to be evaluated by. Another thing I want to bring up, Sherry, really briefly, just that Tanya's comment just pointed out. If this is designed to apply to the early childhood community, and some of you know this is something that I focus on, or is it just about early childhood education, right? We at the Alliance try to be really careful about making sure that we include the word education when we're talking about childcare, so people understand. So, but that's, if this is intended for the entire system, then great. Let's just, it might be good to clarify so that there isn't any confusion that this is intended to be all sectors of service delivery. I think it is. So let's proactively say that, so that's clear as well. Again, not meaning to take away from the work, and I support this. This is intended to just be clarification to make sure that it's received well and as intended, should this go out into a larger audience.
Yeah, those are great points. We don't want to trip over language with any of it, right? Audience, intent, purpose.
Right, and I just put the goal language in the chat, which is all children and families have access to high quality opportunities that meet their needs. And so that's where the discussion really started, was, well, what do we mean by high quality? We are definitely talking beyond early childhood education. So it was identifying some common qualities that we would define what those high quality opportunities are, particularly as the Early Learning and Development Committee is kind of reframing and broadening its lens beyond early care and education, inclusive, but beyond early care and education.
Yeah, and I think we, you know, certainly can reference, you know, that it was a definition created by Early Learning and Development, or not definition. I think we can also talk about calling it something else. So I think we can add to the document to clarify the purpose, the the origin, and think about what if we want to call it something other than definition. Maybe it's some kind of statement, whatever. I think those are, it came through as a definition, but I think that's a good point, and maybe that's a stumbling piece for some. Yes, great idea. Both Eddie and Cynthia are having same thoughts. I think that's a great idea. Awesome. Thanks, Beth. So I just wanted to touch on our next meeting is the 14th. We will take some time for introduction, and it will just be our ELD committee. So I want to take some time for that, and I apologize we didn't have time for that. We will be looking at filling some more gaps, a couple more gaps on this committee. So we may not have some new members next time as well. We thought a couple of the topics to focus on the 14th that we're planning is looking at the recovery funds, you know, that are available in Vermont for young children's services, and specifically hoping to get some report outs from Child Development Division and Agency of Education about the priorities and the plan for any funds that will be there to support young children in the services available. We also are hoping to have a report out on where the federal infrastructure plan is, and what kind of recovery investments, what the status is of those recovery investments in terms of, you know, how Vermont might or may benefit from those. So those are two of the topic areas that we thought we would focus on in October. And then in November, we have our first advisory meeting with the contractors for the early childhood system analysis. And if you have any, please, any topics that you would like us to include, or anything you've attended that you said, boy, we should bring this to ELD, Nicole and I, send those to Nicole and I, and we'll work to include those on a future agenda. And thank you all for taking part today in the discussion and your participation. And Beth will stay on if there's anyone who has questions. And I think we're going to give you 3 minutes back of your day.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Great to see you.